Hello everyone, this is James with Rogue Reader here for another first reading review. This time I'm doing the From a Certain Point of View trilogy of novels that you can see surrounding me here. These are short story collections that were released around the 40th anniversary of each of the original films, so A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. These have been sitting on my shelf for a little bit now, so it's nice to be done with reading through these. Normally, I say I won't go into any spoilers for first reading reviews, at least I don't do spoilers, but these are short story collections, in some cases very short stories, so there's nothing here to really spoil. Originally, I was thinking to do these three books separately, but honestly, my thoughts on all three are pretty much the exact same, so it just made more sense to do them all in one video. So as I mentioned, these were released for the 40th anniversary of each film, and the theme is 40 short stories from 40 different authors surrounding the events of the film in question. These stories are tied into the film and that they take place usually involving characters that are kind of in the background of certain scenes. It's literally from a certain point of view, from a different perspective from these characters. In some cases, this is literally just that, just different reading about different perspectives from people in key scenes. Other times, it's a bit more of an original story involving characters in those scenes. Every once in a while, there'll be an original character story that just kind of takes place around the events of the film in certain key locations. That's generally the idea. Like I said, 40 authors. You're bound to recognize somebody in these collections. It's a return of both older and new writers. The voice actress for Ahsoka herself, I think, actually writes one of these stories. Will Wheaton writes one. I'm sure there's an author here that you would recognize. Even my wife, who doesn't read Star Wars books, recognized a couple of these from some series that she reads. Normally, I like to break these reviews down into the plot, the writing structure, the characters, but I can't really do that for these because they're 40 short stories. They're all over the place. The plots are all over the place. The characters are all different. The writing structure varies from writer to writer, from third person, first person. In some cases, it's a little comic strip, so I can't really do it that traditionally. Instead, I'm just going to kind of just jump right into my thoughts on these. And then I'll also provide just kind of some of my favorites between these collections, my favorite short stories between them. So as I was reading through these, my mind and my thoughts kind of went through a phase of, at first it was like, oh, these are interesting, these are kind of cool, to, oh, okay, whatever. And then by the end of it, it was just a slog. I'm just like, I'm tired. This is too much. And I'm sorry to be so negative, but I just kind of have to jump into my issues, and that the biggest one is that 40 stories is way too much for a collection like this. It doesn't provide enough time for the stories to really do anything significant. So as an example, the first book is 460 pages. Divide that by 40 stories, that's an average of about 11 and a half pages per story. And that obviously varies. There are some stories that were just like 2-3 pages. And when you have those kind of constraints, I found that the short stories, they couldn't do anything interesting. Often you would have stories that were literally just another perspective on a scene and didn't really add anything interesting other than seeing it from another person's eyes. Sometimes the stories would try to do something more unique, but then it would just have an abrupt ending. It would just be over. And I couldn't help but thinking in those cases that maybe the authors didn't know how to get things down within whatever page constraints I'm sure they had. The way they're structured, they're structured based on the order of events in the movie. So that means a lot of times you'll get repeated scenes. So for example, for A New Hope, the early Tatooine and Cantina sections, you're just constantly seeing the same scene just from someone else's perspective, and it just kind of gets tiring. Now, I understand that's the theme of these books. It's from a certain point of view. It's taking the film and showing you a different point of view from other characters. But the fact that they kind of stuck with the theme of 40 short stories for 40 years, I think really hampers these down. I really wish they had reduced the number, maybe like by half, do 20, 25 stories even, and just give them time to flesh them out just a little bit more. These really could have benefited from that. Now, it's not all bad. There were definitely some short stories I enjoyed and I noted separately. So let me go ahead and just talk about some of my favorite short stories from each of these books. And let me get my notes to make this easier. Okay. The Sith of Data Work. This is one of the early stories in A New Hope. It's about the guys who chose to not shoot the escape pod that C-3PO and R2-D2 was in, and they feel like they're going to get in trouble for obviously not what could have ended the whole plot right there if they just chosen to shoot it. So they're going to this Imperial officer to get help in doing a bunch of paperwork and things to like reroute the whole process and just kind of cover up the mistakes they made. That was fun. Stories in the Sand about a Jawa who likes to look at recordings from droids he captures, and he sees the recordings from R2-D2 when he's in the Sandcrawler and realizes how important he is. That was fun. The red one I really liked, about the red R4 droid, or I don't remember what its designation is, the one that blows up that allows R2-D2 to then be bought by Luke instead. That's a fun, seeing it from his perspective, how R2-D2 actually talked with him beforehand and told him how important his mission was, so he did that on purpose. I think that's always been a part of the lore of Star Wars, even pre-Disney, but it's just, again, it was just fun to read. Master and Apprentice was good. That's one where when Luke is off to running back home after his aunt and uncle are killed, we see from Obi-Wan's perspective, and he's talking with Qui-Gon's ghost about events that are to come and just how everything's about to get started. Stories like that where then you can kind of tie it into events of previous films that hadn't come out yet. That's really fun. The bartender in the cantina, I like that he kind of had some history with the Clone Wars, and that's why he's so against droids, because he just remembers when the battle droids took over the galaxy. The story of Long Snoot, that spy with the really big mask, he was interesting in a way that I wanted to see more of him, and this was just another example of a story that I felt was just cut too short. He could have had a much longer story that I think would have been interesting. Lena, this is the one that was written by Will Wheaton. This one was great, about a rebel soldier who wants to protect his daughter before the attack on the Death Star comes. This one actually does have a twist ending that makes it good, so I won't spoil it, but that was probably my favorite in the whole collection. It was Lena by Will Wheaton. We have Eclipse. That's the one by Madeline Rue, who I just reviewed her latest book, Star Wars Legacy, recently, so she did a short story in this collection. That's about Bail and Brea Organa's last moments before they're destroyed by the Death Star. We have an incident report about the guy who got choked by Darth Vader, and it's basically just him filing a complaint that Darth Vader choked him. That was fun. There's a Dr. Aphra story in here, The Trigger, with her on the base on Dantooine. I love Dr. Aphra as a character. I love her comics, and it was fun to get a short story surrounding her. It was quick. It tied up everything. It was just a good example of what I think a short story should be. And then there was Time of Death, which was basically Obi-Wan's perspective as he dies and becomes one with the Force. Those are my favorite short stories from the A New Hope collection. When it comes to Empire Strikes Back, I found there was a little more original characters in this one, and I think that might be due to the fact that there's a lack of identifying a key scene like the Mos Eisley Cantina. You know, if you're gonna have the Mos Eisley Cantina, you're gonna want to explore so many perspectives from those characters, but Empire Strikes Back doesn't really have a scene like that. So same with Return of the Jedi. There's a little bit with Jabba's Palace, but at this point I think they were transitioning to a little bit more of original characters for some of their stories. There's also a little bit more continuity between the stories in this one, like some of the bounty hunter ones connect, which was fun. There wasn't, as I forgot to mention, there's not always a lot of continuity between the stories, especially in the A New Hope one. There's a lot of it actually will contradict a little bit each other, which is fair. It's just the idea of here's looking at it another way. So it's not something it needed. It was just something to point out. Eyes of the Empire for Empire Strikes Back. This was about some of the people that are in charge of the probe droids and are kind of reviewing their footage. And one of them actually ends up catching some footage of Dagobah, and she has to make a decision about that. There's a perspective from the Wampa ice creature called Hunger. That was fun. He kind of goes out to feed his family on this big long hunting trek, and then comes back to find the rebel base is taken over. That was really cool. Rendezvous Point. That was a great Wedge story. That was kind of like this one felt like a proper short story, and it felt like kind of like a Rogue Squadron story from the old Rogue Squadron books. I could see this fitting in perfectly in a short story collection about those. That was fun. How Not to Die probably was a story about the TIE fighter pilots in the asteroid field, kind of the grunts. and just their day-to-day lives. And the main character, she's just kind of giving off a list of rules throughout the whole thing on things you can do to probably not die when serving the Empire. Disturbance, which is a story from Palpatine's point of view, right before he takes the call from Darth Vader and finds out that Luke Skywalker is his son, and you kind of get Palpatine's perspective on that. The Bosk story with Tooth and Claw was good, about a bounty hunting adventure he kind of goes on right before Empire Strikes Back. The Obi-Wan story, There's Always Another, in which we see his perspective as Luke is kind of talking with Yoda about his visions of the future and whether he should go or not. That was just a great example of a scene that we see and we just see it from a different point of view, literally Obi-Wan's, and the context he brings to that. That was an example of a well done version versus some of the other stories where it's literally just them viewing events we've seen and it didn't seem to add anything. There is a story about Jackson, the kind of green bunny rabbit character who was in the old Marvel comics. We get a story about him on Bespin. That was fun. There's a story about L3 in the Millennium Falcon and how her feelings as she kind of gets reunited when Lando comes back in the ship. That was a great connection to Solo. And what's probably the best titled short story in the book, Right Hand Man, which is about the droid who literally is attaching Luke's new hand and his perspective. That was a fun way to close it out. By the time I got to Return of the Jedi, I was just tired. Literally, my notes just say, I'm tired. So many of these stories are just not working, and I found myself kind of skimming through them and being bored because it's, like I said, they just weren't working. And I was, after reading 80 other short stories beforehand, which that was probably my mistake, I shouldn't have read these back to back. I was just ready to be done with these. But there were still some in here I liked. Dune Sea, Songs of Salt and Moonlight. I believe, if I'm correct, this is a story that was pretty much an original story in Jabba's palace about one of the dancers who's trying to essentially pay off her father's debt, who owes something to Jabba. She kind of has a boyfriend who's off adventuring, and then he finds out and he wants to win her back, but he can't quite afford her. And it's a story specifically about this original character. I don't think she's in the film. Maybe she's one of the background dancers. And it felt like a complete short story. It was perfect, the type of thing I would just have loved to have seen more of. I like seeing the background of Malakili, the guy who owns the Rancor. There's a perspective story from the Sarlacc, which is really fun because he's got like a personality, and he's actually, it portrays him as being this kind of nice, really polite creature that just is trying to tell everyone, stop throwing yourselves in my mouth. That was fun. There was an interesting one from the perspective of one of the dragon snakes on Dagobah, just one of the things in the water as it sees Yoda die. Gone to the Winter Circle, about one of the scout troopers on the speeder bikes that tries to run over Luke. When I was reading this one, I knew instantly who it was about because they portray this guy as like a racer who's kind of cocky. And as soon as I was reading that, I was like, oh, this is the stormtrooper that tried to run over Luke, because in that scene, you can tell he's kind of cocky because when he's revving up his engines to go after Luke, you can tell he's like kind of excited, like he thinks he's gonna run over this guy. And I thought that story did a good job where I instantly knew who that was when I started reading it. There are some Ewok stories. I'm a big Ewok fan. I think I've mentioned it before. I have an Ewok collection. You can't see them. They're kind of on a shelf above me, but there's a story about Wicket, which I liked. And then there's a story kind of about those two Ewoks in that tragic scene where one gets killed and he's kind of like shaking his body, and there's a story about them. So those I liked. The Man Who Captured Luke Skywalker, about the Imperial officer who is the one that kind of officially captures Luke when he turns himself in and has to take him to Vader. That was interesting. There's a story about Dexter from Attack of the Clones and his perspective on Coruscant after the fall of the Empire and kind of the rioting that's going on. That was a unique way to explore that scene, and with a character from prequel movies. And Brotherhood, which, similar to the Obi-Wan story where he dies and kind of becomes one with the Force, is about Anakin when he dies and becomes one with the Force and kind of reunites with Obi-Wan and Yoda. That was well done. So there we go. Those were my favorite stories. I had maybe about 10 out of 40 per book. So about 30 out of 120 stories were ones I actually enjoyed. I think it's important to say these books' purpose, I think, to me, should be that they should add something to your film viewing experience. So do they do that? Very rarely. And for the most part, I don't think these really add anything to the film experience, where you can point at a character and be like, oh, I know what they're doing, or I know how important they are playing in a scene. You don't really get that from reading these. There are some some of the ones I mentioned included. But for the most part, I don't really think they fulfill their job at providing interesting alternate perspectives on the films. It's a weird case where having so many stories that are too short to read through make the whole thing feel much longer, if that makes sense. Now, there was one good thing I got out of these, and that I think some of these short stories would be fun to include in a tandem read with the film novelizations. And I actually was taking some notes on that on the side. Some of these you could kind of swap in and certain parts of the novelization chapters and kind of a tandem read and kind of make, I think, a more interesting reading experience when doing those. So at some point, probably far in the future, I'll make a video where I'll maybe suggest kind of like a tandem reading from these. But I would say that's probably the best thing I got out of these. So do I recommend these? If it's not clear by now, no, I unfortunately cannot recommend the From a Certain Point of View trilogy as of right now. If you do decide to pick them up, don't make the mistake I did. Don't read these back to back. You are going to burn yourself out way too quickly. Now, I have heard that I believe there are audio versions of each of these books, and I think that the audio versions are a little more special, like they put a little more effort into them. I don't know that to be sure. I remember reading something about that for these books. So it's possible that the audio versions might be more approachable for these, and it might be more fun to kind of listen through these, especially if they have a bit more effort put into them. But in terms of just reading them as short stories themselves, I just cannot recommend, unfortunately. Well, that's it for today's video on From a Certain Point of View. I'm sure they'll do another one of these when we get the Phantom Menace From a Certain Point of View. So we'll see. I hope they don't stick with the 40 stories theme and they lessen it down a bit, but we'll see when that time comes. For now, that's it for today's video. I hope you have a good day, and may the force be with you.